There is a vault of truth buried beneath decades of silence, and inside it sits a story that could rewrite the economic history of Africa. Not a myth. Not a legend. A documented secret involving one of the most powerful rulers the world has ever known, a man who sat at the intersection of ancient prophecy and modern geopolitics, and billions of dollars in diamonds that, to this day, have never been fully accounted for. This is not just a story about wealth. This is a story about who controls African resources, who decides what gets recorded as history, and what happens to a continent's legacy when the wrong hands seize the narrative. For the African diaspora, from Addis Ababa to Atlanta, from Kingston to Lagos, from London to Sao Paulo, this story carries stakes that reach far beyond 1974. It reaches into your present. It touches your future. Because when African wealth disappears, it doesn't just vanish into a vacuum. It gets absorbed by systems designed to keep that wealth away from African people. Understanding what happened to Haile Selassie's hidden diamonds is understanding a pattern that has repeated itself across the African continent for centuries. And knowing the pattern is the first step to breaking it. Haile Selassie I, born Lige Teferi Cohen on July 23, 1892, in the village of Ijasegoro in the Hora province of Ethiopia, was no ordinary ruler. He was, by the reckoning of Rastafarian theology, the returned Messiah, the Lion of Judah, the King of Kings, the elect of God. By the reckoning of global politics, he was one of the shrewdest and most consequential leaders of the 20th century. He claimed direct descent from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, making his imperial lineage over 3,000 years deep. When he was crowned Emperor of Ethiopia on November 2, 1930, the ceremony was attended by representatives from across the globe, including European royalty and American dignitaries. The world was watching. Ethiopia, one of only two African nations never fully colonized by European powers, the other being Liberia, stood as a beacon of black sovereignty in a world still drenched in colonial domination. Selassie ruled for over 4 decades, presiding over a nation sitting atop extraordinary natural wealth. Ethiopia's highlands contained gold, platinum, tantalum, potash, and diamonds, significant deposits of diamonds concentrated primarily in the Horori and Tigray regions, some known to imperial surveyors, some known only to trusted members of the royal household. According to documents that surfaced in European financial archives in the 1990s and investigative reporting published in the early 2000s, Selassie had accumulated, through a combination of state revenue, international gifts, and covert trading operations, a personal fortune estimated in its totality at somewhere between $6 and $10 billion in current value. The most concentrated and concealable portion of that fortune, estimated at $8.7 billion in today's diamond market values, existed in the form of raw and cut diamonds, stored across multiple locations including vaults in Switzerland, private deposits in London, and, significantly, within Ethiopia itself. When the Derg, the Soviet-backed military junta led by Mengistu Haile Mariam, staged their coup in September 1974 and placed Selassie under house arrest, the race to locate those diamonds began immediately. What followed the 1974 coup was one of the most calculated acts of historical erasure in modern African history. The Derg did not simply seize power. They systematically dismantled the infrastructure of imperial Ethiopia's memory. Selassie was strangled, according to most credible accounts, on August 27, 1975, and his body was buried beneath a concrete slab under the floor of a latrine on the palace grounds. Think about that. A man whose lineage stretched back to Solomon, buried under a toilet. That was not carelessness. That was a message, a deliberate act of symbolic annihilation designed to erase his legacy from Ethiopian consciousness. The Derg then moved to liquidate or conceal what they could find of the imperial treasury. State archives were seized, private correspondence was burned, and financial records connecting Selassie to his foreign accounts were systematically destroyed or transferred to Soviet handlers who had no interest in transparency. But the diamonds were the real prize. European banking institutions, particularly in Switzerland, which has a long and documented history of holding African wealth under conditions that prevent repatriation, became complicit in the burial of this treasure. Swiss banking laws at the time made it nearly impossible for any successor Ethiopian government to claim accounts opened under imperial authority. The accounts simply froze, the assets absorbed into the compound interest of institutions that had spent decades profiting from African colonial wealth. British intelligence, too, played a documented role in managing what was known about Selassie's foreign assets. Declassified Foreign Office cables from 1975 and 1976 show British officials actively discussing how to handle the question of Selassie's London-held assets without triggering a diplomatic incident with the Derg. The conclusion, evident in those cables, was to quietly manage the situation, which is diplomatic language for doing nothing while the wealth sat inaccessible. Meanwhile, Western media coverage of the coup focused almost entirely on the Cold War dimension, the Soviet influence, the Marxist ideology of the Derg, and almost entirely ignored the question of the imperial wealth. That omission was not accidental. Reporters who raised the question of Selassie's diamonds found their stories buried, their sources questioned, their credibility attacked. The narrative was controlled. The diamonds were not to be discussed. And so they weren't, not in any mainstream venue, not for decades. But here is the enduring truth about African history: you can bury the record, but you cannot bury the memory. The people remember. The culture remembers. And the culture of Ethiopia is one of the most resilient meaning-making systems the world has ever produced. Consider the Guizi script, one of the oldest alphabets in continuous use anywhere on Earth, dating back to at least the 5th century BC. When European colonizers could not penetrate Ethiopia, they could not impose their language. And because they could not impose their language, Ethiopians retained the ability to write their own history in their own words. The Kebre Negast, The Glory of Kings, a 14th century text that chronicles the lineage of the Solomonic dynasty, survived every coup, every war, every act of suppression. It survives today. It is still read. Selassie himself quoted from it in his 1963 address to the United Nations. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, established in the 4th century and representing the oldest continuously practicing Christian institution in Africa, served as the keeper of records, genealogies, and, critically, the knowledge of where certain imperial treasures were located. Church elders in Lalibela, in Aksum, in Gondar, held oral traditions that no military junta could confiscate. The rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, carved directly into volcanic basalt in the 12th century under King Lalibela's direction, stand today as one of the most extraordinary architectural achievements in human history, and they stand untouched, unlooted, unbowed. The obelisks of Aksum, stolen by Mussolini's fascist forces in 1937 and taken to Rome, were eventually returned to Ethiopia in 2008, a small but significant act of cultural restitution that affirmed the enduring power of Ethiopian claims over their own heritage. And then there is the Rastafari movement, born in Jamaica in the 1930s, shaped in part by Marcus Garvey's prophetic declaration that Africa would find its Redeemer, which transformed Haile Selassie into a global spiritual symbol. Through reggae music, through art, through theology, through community, Rastafari carried the story of Ethiopia's imperial dignity to every corner of the African diaspora. The knowledge of Selassie's significance